What was the fate of the ancient king who was so rich, his name is still synonymous with wealth today? Was the beautiful Queen Nefertiti an Egyptian noble? Or was she a foreign bride meant to unite two Bronze Age powers? The first of the three incredible forgotten ancient kingdoms that we're going to look at today is called the Kingdom of Lydia. The Kingdom of Lydia existed from roughly 1200 BC to about 546 BC, and it was located in western Anatolia, or what is now Turkey. The origins of the Lydian Empire are very mysterious. The people who would become the Lydians migrated to western Anatolia around 1200 BC. Maybe. It's hard to say where they came from or when, and that's because the bulk of the inscriptions that we have from the Lydian Empire, they date from the 6th to 4th century BC. So the first several centuries of Lydian history are almost completely unknown to us today. But by the time those inscriptions start appearing, the Lydians were clearly a well-established, well-known empire, renowned for their riches and wealth, and some would even say their decadence. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. So the Lydians took their name from a very early, possibly mythological king named Midas. And the heartland of their kingdom was in the area around their capital city called Sardis. So Sardis was the only urban center of the Lydian kingdom in the Iron Age. And the reason that location was initially settled likely has something to do with a nearby river. That river was filled with something called electrum. Electrum is a naturally occurring gold and silver alloy. So that was an incredible resource for the Lydians to have right nearby. Lydia was very well known to the Greek-speaking peoples at that time. There was trade and commerce that went back and forth between the peoples, and the Greek-speaking peoples were incredibly impressed by Lydia's wealth and cosmopolitan airs. And the Greek historian Herodotus tells us that although the Lydians and Greeks spoke two different languages, they were very similar in their customs and religious practices. And Herodotus tells us that the Lydian people were the first ones to mint gold and silver coins in history. And that claim is actually backed up by modern archaeologists and coin specialists. So in order to test the purity of gold objects, the Lydians would drag the gold across a special stone. If the gold left behind a yellow streak, they knew it was pure or likely to be mostly pure gold. If the object in question left behind a red or other colored line on the touchstone, then they knew that it wasn't pure gold and that person wasn't to be trusted. And in ancient times, these stones came to be known as Lydian stones. Now, while the Lydians were known for their horsemanship and cavalry prowess, they were severely tested by another culture that had incredible mounted warriors, and these people were called the Cimmerians. This nomadic people was the scourge of Anatolia for several decades. The Cimmerians even sacked Sardis multiple times during the 600s BC. After the Cimmerian threat was defeated by Alyattes in the early 600s BC, Lydia prospered like never before. During this time, Lydia was able to extract tribute from other peoples in western Anatolia and add to its wealth, power, and influence. Now that's all very cool and interesting, but if anyone's even heard of Lydia today, it likely has something to do with their last and most famous king, Croesus. Under King Croesus, the Lydians reached their absolute height of power and influence thanks to their control over the trade routes in Asia Minor and their access to the Aegean Sea. Sardis became a center of learning and culture, and Sardis was supposedly visited by the Greek philosopher and lawmaker Solon, according to Herodotus. We're told this happened not long after Croesus became king in about 560 BC. Now, the meeting between Solon and Croesus is likely mythologized a little bit, but it's still an absolutely fascinating story, and it paints Croesus to be a somewhat tragic figure. So apparently King Croesus asked Solon who was the happiest man that Solon had ever met. So at this time, Solon was probably near the end of his life. He would have been about 70 years old, and Croesus was probably in his mid-30s, so just keep that in mind. In response to Croesus's question, Solon named several common Greeks who lived simple lives of contentment. The king was shocked that Solon would claim such simple men could lead such happy lives. Croesus responded, and he said, "That's all very well, my Athenian friend, but what of my own happiness? Is it so contemptible that you won't even compare me with mere common folk like those you've mentioned?" Solon thought for a moment, and then he replied, "Now I see that you are very rich and the king of many men. But I cannot yet answer your question before I hear that you have ended your life well. For he who is very rich is not more blessed than he who has but enough for the day, unless fortune see to it that he ends his life well. We must look to the conclusion of every matter and see how it shall end. For there are many to whom heaven has given a vision of blessedness, and yet afterwards brought them to utter ruin." Solon goes on to tell the king that a happy man is one who dies a peaceful death. After hearing that, Croesus sent Solon away, thinking that the great philosopher was nothing more than an old man and a fool. What did he know? But a little more than a decade later, Cyrus the Great of Persia looked to the west, thinking to expand his already great empire. And what did Cyrus see? The incredibly wealthy Lydian Empire ready for the picking. Now this is happening around probably 548, 540 BC. The dating is a little bit shaky because the sources are a little confused about the chronology, but thereabouts it happened. But the important thing to know is that Croesus decided to preemptively strike at Cyrus the Great. King Croesus set out at the head of the Lydian army to meet the Persians in battle near the Halys River, well east of Sardis. The two great armies fought each other to a standstill, but Croesus thought to gain an advantage by retreating to Sardis and asking for help from his Babylonian allies. Cyrus was no fool, so he pursued Croesus and the Lydian army, or what was left of it, right back to Sardis. He didn't want to give them a chance to get any reinforcements or any help from their allies. Cyrus forced the Lydian army into a pitched battle outside the very walls of their capital city, Sardis. And sadly for the Lydians, their famous cavalry failed them when they were needed most. Supposedly, Cyrus used camels to scatter the Lydian cavalry, whose horses weren't used to the strange sights or smells of the camels. A brief siege followed the defeat of the Lydian army, and Cyrus conquered Sardis in just 2 weeks. And not only did Cyrus lay claim to the great wealth and incredible resources of the Lydian Empire, he also captured their king, Croesus. So what happened to Croesus, the last king of independent Lydia? According to a Babylonian tablet, Cyrus, quote, annihilated Lydia and its king. But that tablet can be translated to mean that the king was killed, or it can be translated to mean that Lydia was destroyed as a military power. But we have another version of the fate of Croesus. The Greek poet Bacchylides tells us that Croesus attempted to commit suicide on a funeral pyre, but was rescued by the gods. At the last moment, the gods intervened, whisked Croesus off of the pyre, and took him to an earthly paradise. But there's still another version of the fate of Croesus. Herodotus tells us that Cyrus planned to execute Croesus on a funeral pyre. After Croesus was tied down onto the funeral pyre and they were getting ready to set the thing alight, Croesus called out something to the effect of, "Solon was right." This strange exclamation stopped Cyrus in his tracks, and he told his men to stop immediately, not to light the pyre. Cyrus immediately stopped the execution from taking place and told his men to bring Croesus to him. Cyrus asked Croesus about the strange words he'd said, so close to what would have been his death. Croesus told Cyrus the whole story of meeting Solon, about what happiness does or doesn't mean. And according to Herodotus, Cyrus was so moved by the Lydian king's story that he spared his life. He might have even made him an advisor. It's, again, not perfectly clear. Now, that would have made sense, because the problem with Herodotus' story is that many modern historians take issue with it because it seems so out of character for what we know about Cyrus. Cyrus was known for being merciful, for sparing the lives of many of the kings whose kingdoms he'd conquered. This was a part of Cyrus's strategy of tolerance. He didn't want to kill these kings and create martyrs out of them so that the conquered peoples could later rally around them or their memory. So we have 3 different versions of the story of the fate of Croesus, the richest king since Midas. But ultimately, his fate's likely to remain a mystery unless something incredible is found. The second incredible ancient forgotten kingdom we're going to talk about is the state of Mitanni. The Mitanni state was formed from a mixture of 2 very distinct peoples, an Indo-Aryan warrior class and the native Hurrian peoples. So the Mitanni spoke Hurrian, but they might have worshipped gods that have Indo-Aryan roots. They were based in northern Mesopotamia, and they were hemmed in by the Hittites to the west, the Assyrians to the east, and the Egyptians to the south. But despite being surrounded by other great powers, the Mitanni were able to hold their own through excellent horsemanship and innovations in war chariots. We know they were great horsemen thanks to a horse training manual written by a Mitanni that was found in Hattusa. This is the oldest horse training manual that's ever been found. So what was so special about a Mitanni chariot? The big innovation was that the Mitanni used spoked wheels on their chariots instead of solid ones. This allowed the Mitanni chariots to be more maneuverable and to be lighter and faster. So as a result, even though they're not as well known as their rivals, the Mitanni are considered by modern historians to be part of the Great Powers Club. So the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Hittites, and the Mitanni. The reason the Mitanni aren't as well known as those other great empires is because they didn't leave behind much of a written record. So the everyday lives and religion of the Mitanni are pretty obscure to us. And in order to understand them at all, historians have to make use of the rival powers sources and kind of triangulate using their enemies and sometimes their allies' sources to figure anything out about them. In fact, the Mitanni were all but completely forgotten until 1887, when the Amarna tablets were discovered. These cuneiform tablets included letters between the pharaoh Amenhotep III and the Mitanni king Tushratta. Now, at its beginning, the Mitanni and Egyptians were rivals. They were constantly in conflict over control over what is now Syria. But by the time those letters were written, the Mitanni and the Egyptians were on good terms. They'd formed an alliance cemented by the marriage of pharaohs to Mitanni princesses in order to check the power and influence of the Hittites to the west. Unfortunately, that alliance was not enough to save Mitanni though. Mitanni was conquered by the Hittites, and then after that, the Assyrians swept through the region, they rolled up what was left of Mitanni, and they made that once great empire into a vassal state. And that probably happened by about the mid-1200s BC. And it seems like in the process of conquering that state, the Assyrians absolutely obliterated the Mitanni records and civilization and culture. All hope is not lost. We might soon learn a lot more about the Mitanni. In 1980, a dam project submerged unexplored ruins of a Mitanni city. But in 2022, severe drought conditions re-exposed the city, and they allowed researchers to perform a hasty excavation on the site. And the site is believed to be a Mitanni city called Zakiku. So in January and February of 2022, researchers were able to map the city. They uncovered an extensive set of walls, and they also found a vast storehouse that made them believe that this city was once a great trading center. And on top of that, they made one more absolutely incredible find. So what did they find? They found 100 cuneiform tablets safely ensconced in ceramic jars. This is an absolutely miraculous finding because the clay tablets were unfired and they were submerged in water. This was a 3,400-year-old city, and these tablets are readable. They're in the process of being translated right now. Unfortunately, the site of what is believed to be Zakiku is back underwater, but the archaeologists at the site prepared the site for this eventuality. They covered the site with plastic tarps and gravel fill to hopefully protect and preserve the ruins for the next time that they're exposed, so further excavations could take place. Who knows what else might be found there, and who knows what is on those tablets that might reveal incredible things about the Mitanni to us. But we can't talk about this empire without mentioning one of the great mysteries from its history. And that mystery is whether or not Queen Nefertiti, the famed beauty of Egypt, was actually from Mitanni. So this is an old debate, and modern opinion says that Nefertiti was probably the daughter of well-to-do or noble Egyptian parents. But there's no absolutely clear-cut evidence for her parentage. And that's actually the case for many Egyptian queens though. But there's also an argument that she might be the daughter of the last king of independent Mitanni, Tushratta. So there's no debate that King Tushratta sent one of his daughters to the pharaoh to be married and further cement the bond between their two peoples. This daughter was named Tadukipa, and she was sent to marry Amenhotep III. But before she was able to get to Egypt, Amenhotep III, he died. So possibly Tadukipa simply became a member of the harem of the next pharaoh, Akhenaten, because there's no further mention of her. And at the same time she would have arrived at the Egyptian court, suddenly there's mentions of Queen Nefertiti. And to be fair, her name, Nefertiti, does mean the beautiful one who has come. So you could possibly interpret that to mean that Nefertiti was actually a foreigner who came to Egypt. Although we should note that Nefertiti wasn't an uncommon name. There are actually many Egyptian women who had that same name. And according to modern scholarship, there's a big problem with the Mitanni theory. Nefertiti became the great wife of Akhenaten, and it would have been very uncommon for a foreign princess to A, adopt an Egyptian name, and B, to rise to such great heights in power. But then again, Akhenaten and Nefertiti were not your typical Egyptian rulers. They instituted a cultural revolution, and they brought in radically different religious beliefs to ancient Egypt, including monotheism. But monotheism doesn't fit in too well with what little we know about the Mitanni religious beliefs, so that might not make sense either. But on the other hand, so little is known about those religious beliefs that anything's possible. Maybe Nefertiti was rebelling not only against her own culture and religion, but also against that of her new culture and religion in Egypt. If that was the case, we could only speculate about how much of Nefertiti's background in Mitanni would have influenced her religious views in Egypt. And increasingly, there's more and more evidence to suggest that Nefertiti was actually a cousin to Akhenaten. And there's another piece of evidence that goes against the Mitanni theory. There's a tomb inscription that indicates that Nefertiti's sister was an Egyptian woman. But whatever her origins, Nefertiti was a very unusual, fascinating queen. She was known to be highly influential, and she was often depicted in inscriptions in situations that were highly unusual for anyone who wasn't the pharaoh, for instance, smiting an enemy. So it seems like the mystery of Nefertiti's origins has mostly been solved, but what do you think? The capital city of Mitanni has never been found. It remains undiscovered to this day. It's called Washukanni, and it's a lost city. And who knows what amazing things we could learn about this incredible empire if that city were to be found. Our last kingdom on this list is probably the least well known, and it's called Tuwana, or Tyana. This kingdom was probably at the height of its power in the 9th and 8th century BC, and while there's a lot of unknowns about it, it might have a surprising impact on our lives today. Tuwana was located in what is now south-central Turkey. After the Hittite Empire fell, Tuwana rose to prominence and filled the power vacuum in central Anatolia. And by the 9th and 8th century BC, Tuwana was at its height as an Iron Age power. It leveraged its position between the Assyrian and Phrygian empires as a trading hub. It was able to facilitate trade throughout Anatolia. And another thing that Tuwana had going for it is it had very fertile soil all around it. So based on its trade and its agriculture, it was able to develop an incredible wealth. Now, most of what's known about this kingdom comes from a handful of mentions in Assyrian documents and just a few inscriptions. Now, only a short series of kings of Tuwana is actually known, and that's due to those inscriptions and due to an incredible rock relief that you can see right here. But here's where Tuwana gets really interesting. The kingdom used a hieroglyphic script called Lydian at first, but later on in its history, it adopted the alphabetical Phoenician script, the basis of the modern alphabet that we still use today. This could actually be incredibly important. That's because Tuwana's geographical position made it a link between East and West. It was a bridge for culture and other ideas to flow back and forth. This forgotten kingdom would have been in frequent contact with the Hellenes on the Greek peninsula. So that means it's possible that Tuwana might have been the conduit for that alphabet and script to flow into Greece, and then for them to carry it on forward in history. But right now, that's still just speculation. Unfortunately for Tuwana, while its central location was a boon for trade, it also made it ripe for the picking from rival empires, in this case the Assyrians. And by the early 700s BC, Assyria had rendered Tuwana no longer independent, and it seems like it was paying tribute to the Assyrians like many other kingdoms in the area. And after 700 BC, the kingdom of Tuwana all but vanishes from the historical record. And again, there's not that much known about it, but that might change with the relatively recent discovery of a huge archaeological site. The site is called Kinnick Hoyek, and it started to be excavated in 2011. It's 24 hectares large, or almost 60 acres. There's evidence of a citadel, large-scale storage silos, and much more there already. Archaeologists have found terracotta figurines, they found coins, they found statues, and so much more. And with this incredible find, archaeologists might finally be able to start filling in some of the blanks about this kingdom that, while it's so little known and almost completely forgotten today, probably played a huge role in our history and development. There's already been some papers documenting some incredible finds that have come out of the site, but you have to think there's just going to be more and more coming out in the coming years, or at least we can hope. So there you have it. There's 3 more incredible, almost forgotten ancient kingdoms. I've been going on for a little while now, so thank you so much for sticking around. I really appreciate it. My name is Jay. This channel is called Iceberg Theory X, and I hope you'll hit that like button so we can share our passion and excitement for ancient history with even more people.